numbers that, by almost any conventional measure, should have made him feel completely secure. A stable career in the credit union industry, a steady paycheck, arriving every 2 weeks without fail, direct deposit landing quietly in his account like clockwork, the kind of job his immigrant parents had once dreamed their son might eventually hold, a job that represented, in very real terms, the entire reason they'd left the Philippines in the first place, searching for a version of stability they'd never had access to themselves. He can still remember, faintly, being a boy and hearing his parents talk in low voices about what they wanted for him. Not adventure, not passion, not some grand personal fulfillment, simply security, simply a life where money wasn't a constant, gnawing source of fear, the way it had so often been for them. And here he was, an adult now, sitting inside exactly that security, surrounded by everything that was supposed to signal success, health benefit, a retirement account slowly accumulating in the background, a title on a business card that would have made his younger self proud. And yet, sitting there at his desk, staring at that spreadsheet, he felt something he couldn't quite explain to the people around him, a quiet, persistent sense that he was building a life according to instructions he'd never actually chosen for himself. Instructions inherited rather than examined, followed rather than questioned. Go to school, get a stable job, climb the ladder, one predictable rung at a time, save diligently for a distant retirement, decades away, that he could barely picture with any real clarity. Some version of himself at 65 he'd never actually met, never actually imagined in any detail beyond the vague image of a beach chair and a modest bank balance. He'd followed every one of these instructions carefully, exactly the way he'd been taught to, and the result was a life that looked responsible from the outside and felt, somehow, quietly hollow from the inside, like a house built to code, structurally sound, professionally inspected, and yet, somehow, never quite feeling like a home. He describes, later, sitting in that same office on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, nothing dramatic happening around him, no crisis, no confrontation, simply the low hum of the air conditioning and the quiet clicking of keyboards from the surrounding cubicle, and feeling a wave of something he could only describe afterward as a kind of grief for years that were passing steadily, predictably, comfortably, and yet somehow without him ever having paused to ask if this particular version of comfortable was actually the one he would have chosen, given the chance to choose freely, rather than simply the one that had been handed to him, one careful, well-intentioned instruction at a time. He thought about his parents, working double shifts decades earlier, arriving home exhausted, never once complaining in front of him, and he felt a fresh wave of guilt layered on top of the original hollowness. Because how could he possibly justify feeling unsatisfied inside a life built specifically from their sacrifice, a life that represented, by every measure they'd ever taught him to value, an unambiguous success? The guilt very nearly kept him at that desk for another decade, the way it keeps countless people at countless desks, in countless careers, quietly enduring a hollowness they've never felt entitled to name, because naming it feels, somehow, like an insult to whoever worked so hard to make that particular comfort possible in the first place. So he did something that genuinely alarmed nearly everyone in his life, something that felt, to his own family, almost like a betrayal of everything they'd sacrificed to give him. He quit. Not to chase some reckless, irresponsible fantasy, not out of some sudden midlife crisis dressed up as spontaneity, to travel, deliberately, intentionally, for an entire year, backpacking across multiple countries with a modest budget and no fixed plan, in search of something he couldn't fully articulate yet, but that he knew, with absolute certainty, he wasn't going to find sitting behind that same desk for. Another 30 years, waiting for a version of freedom that always seemed to live, one more promotion, one more raise, one more decade away. Here's the question that decision forced him to confront, over and over, in hostels, on long train rides, in conversations with strangers from completely different corners of the world. A question that would eventually become the foundation of everything he'd go on to teach. What is money actually supposed to be for? Not in the vague, someday sense everyone defaults to. Specifically, honestly, in service of what kind of life, what kind of value, what kind of purpose. His name is Jason Vitug, and the year he spent traveling, stepping entirely outside the predictable script he'd been following his whole life, became the foundation for a completely different way of thinking about money, one he'd eventually write down and share with anyone willing to ask themselves the same uncomfortable question he'd once asked himself, alone, in a hostile bunk bed on the other side of the world, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, or finally, the first fully honest decision of it. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why he came to believe points toward something far more demanding and far more rewarding, and why understanding your own money story, life you simply inherited by default. Let's go back to where this all actually started, because Vitug's own relationship with money didn't begin with any of this clarity at all. It began, like it does for so many people, with a story he never consciously chose, one absorbed simply by growing up inside a specific family, in a specific set of circumstances, in a specific kitchen, where certain topics were discussed openly, and others were only ever whispered about after the children were supposed to be asleep. His parents had immigrated from the Philippines, building a life in the United States through steady, disciplined work, the kind of quiet sacrifice that immigrant families across the world understand intimately, working hard, saving carefully, clipping coupons, driving older cars long past when friends and neighbors had already upgraded, and hoping their children might eventually have opportunities they themselves never had access to. Growing up inside that story, Vitug absorbed a very specific definition of what financial success was supposed to look like: stability, security, a respectable career, the kind of life that would make his parents' sacrifices feel worthwhile, the kind of life that would justify every hour spent working jobs that weren't glamorous, weren't fulfilling in any deep sense, but were steady, dependable, safe. And for years, he pursued exactly that, eventually landing in the credit union industry, an environment that gave him something genuinely valuable: small, human decisions that never show up in a textbook about personal finance. Here's what he started noticing, sitting across the desk from member after member, year after year, in conversations that were technically about loan applications and savings accounts, but that were really, underneath the surface, about something far more personal. Money problems were almost never really about money itself. They were about stories, inherited beliefs, unexamined assumptions about what money was for, what success was supposed to look like, and what a person deserved or didn't deserve. Stories that had usually been absorbed decades earlier, often before the person sitting across from him had ever earned a single paycheck of their own. He remembers, distinctly, a woman in her 50s who came in asking about a modest personal loan, and who spent nearly the entire appointment apologizing over and over for needing to ask at all, as though requesting help with money was itself some kind of moral failing, something to be embarrassed about, rather than simply a normal part of managing a financial life. He remembers a young couple, newly married, sitting stiffly on opposite sides of his desk, clearly avoiding eye contact with each other, because one of them wanted to save aggressively for a home down payment, and the other wanted to spend more freely on experiences while they were still young. And neither one had ever actually said this openly to the other before that exact meeting. the disagreement quietly festering underneath years of unspoken assumptions about what a responsible marriage was supposed to look like financially. He remembers, too, a retired factory worker who came in every month, almost ritually, simply to check his balance in person rather than online, even though the numbers rarely changed in any meaningful way between visits, and who eventually admitted, after months of this same quiet ritual, that seeing an actual person confirm his balance verbally gave him a sense of security no digital notification ever quite managed to provide, a small, human detail that taught Vitug something about the emotional, not merely mechanical, dimension of financial security, mediated through trust in actual relationships and actual institutions, rather than existing as some abstract, purely numerical confidence floating independently of any human context at all. And he remembers a small business owner, a woman running a modest neighborhood shop, who came in seeking a loan to expand, and who spent much of the appointment second, guessing herself, apologizing for her own ambition, clearly carrying some inherited belief that wanting more for her business, wanting to grow beyond what she currently had, was somehow greedy or unrealistic, a belief Vitug found himself gently, directly challenging, not by dismissing her caution, but by asking her clearly what she actually wanted her business to become, and watching her visibly struggle to answer a question she had apparently never once been asked directly by anyone in her life, including herself. These accumulated conversations, small and human as each one, was individually, gradually built in Vitug an unshakable conviction that the technical side of finance, interest rates, loan terms, savings vehicle, was almost never the actual obstacle standing between people and the lives they wanted to build. The obstacle was almost always this quieter, more personal layer underneath, unexamined beliefs, unspoken assumptions, inherited fears, and unasked questions, sitting invisibly beneath every single spreadsheet, every loan application, and every hesitant, apologetic request for something as simple as a modest business loan. These conversations planted a seed that wouldn't fully bloom until his own year of travel, but they were already quietly reshaping how he thought about his work, and eventually about his own life, teaching him something no financial textbook had ever mentioned directly, that behind every spreadsheet, every loan application, every savings goal, let's talk about that year abroad directly, because it's genuinely central to everything Vitug eventually built, and it's worth walking through in some detail, because the specific experiences along the way matter. He didn't set out with some grand, clearly defined mission. He set out with a backpack, a modest budget carefully calculated to stretch across as many months as possible, and a genuine willingness to be uncomfortable, to not know exactly what came next, something that terrified him initially, having spent his entire adult life, up to that point, inside carefully planned, predictable structures, traveling through multiple countries, meeting people living according to completely different definitions of a good life than the one he'd grown up assuming was universal. He began noticing something that challenged nearly everything he'd previously believed about financial success. There's a specific memory he returns to often, staying in a small village where a family with considerably less material wealth than his own upbringing had ever experienced insisted on sharing their evening meal with him. A stranger passing through, refusing any payment, treating hospitality as an obligation of genuine warmth rather than a transaction to be carefully calculated. He remembers sitting there, eating food that had clearly required real sacrifice from a family with very little to spare, and feeling something he hadn't expected to feel. Not pity, not guilt exactly, but a kind of quiet astonishment at how genuinely connected seemed compared to plenty of financially comfortable people he'd left behind in New Jersey, who nonetheless seemed perpetually distracted, perpetually anxious, perpetually chasing some further, undefined level of security that never quite arrived. This wasn't a naive romanticization of poverty, and it's important to be clear about that, because scarcity, genuine scarcity, brings real hardship, real limitation, real suffering that shouldn't be dismissed or predified from the comfortable distance of a backpacker passing through for a single evening. It was, instead, a genuine, humbling realization that the specific link between money and a meaningful life was far more complicated, far more personal, than the simple, linear story he'd absorbed growing up. More money, more security, more success automatically equals more fulfillment. That, once examined honestly against what he was actually witnessing across dozens of different communities, simply didn't hold up consistently at all. In another country, months into his trip, he found himself in a lengthy conversation with an older man who'd spent his entire life running a small, modest business, never expanding it significantly, never chasing the kind of scale or growth that Vitug's own professional training had taught him to view as the obvious, self-evident goal of any business owner. When Vitug asked why, gently, curiously, the man simply said that his business gave him exactly enough to support his family, to contribute meaningfully to his community, and to spend his afternoons with his grandchildren. Business was supposed to be providing in the first place. Vitug describes this conversation as one of the moments that cracked something open in his own thinking, because it directly contradicted an assumption he'd absorbed so completely he'd never even noticed he was carrying it. Any reasonable person, given the choice, would obviously choose to grow, to expand, to accumulate further, rather than deliberately choosing enough and stopping there. There's another moment from that year worth including here, one that took place high in a mountain region, where Vitug found himself sharing a long, slow bus ride with a handful of other travelers, the kind of trip where there's nothing to do for hours but talk. And eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned to money, to why each of them had left behind whatever stable life they'd once been building. One of them, a woman roughly his own age, had walked away from a promising legal career, describing years of 18-hour days spent earning an impressive salary she'd had almost no time or energy left to actually enjoy, money accumulating steadily in an account she rarely even checked, while her actual daily experience of life had grown thinner and thinner, more exhausted, more disconnected from anything she could point to as genuinely meaningful. Another, an older man traveling with a small, well-worn backpack and seemingly no fixed timeline at all, he'd always quietly wanted to. A freedom he now treasured, but that had arrived, he admitted candidly, decades later than he wished it had, because he'd never once questioned the assumption that adventure was something to be earned only after a lifetime of dutiful, predictable work had been fully completed first. Listening to these two very different stories, to discover that freedom deferred that long comes with its own particular cost, an entire stretch of vigorous, energetic years spent waiting rather than living. Neither story was presented as a cautionary tale exactly, and neither person seemed to regret their own specific path entirely. Together, they crystallized something Vitug had been circling for months, without quite being able to name directly, kind of quiet, retrospective regret, whether that regret shows up as burnout in your 30s, or as decades of deferred living finally granted only once your body and energy have already begun to change. There's a third encounter worth mentioning from later in that same year, this one considerably quieter, involving an elderly woman he met while volunteering briefly at a small community kitchen in a coastal town, someone who had survived genuine hardship earlier in her life, wars, displacement, real scarcity that Vitug's own comfortable upbringing had never remotely approached. When he asked her, somewhat hesitantly, what she'd learned about money across such a long, difficult, eventful life. She told him something that he wrote down immediately afterward, unwilling to risk forgetting it. An idea translated roughly into the notion that money had only ever been useful to her as a way of protecting the people and moments she loved, never as something valuable simply for its own sake, and that the years she'd spent afraid of not having enough had cost her far more in quiet, chronic anxiety than the actual periods of genuine scarcity themselves ever had. This conversation, more than almost any other single moment from that entire year, planted the specific seed that would eventually grow into his distinction between financial success and financial wellness. The recognition that a person could survive real, serious hardship and still emerge with a clearer, healthier relationship to money than someone who had never experienced hardship at all, simply because she'd been forced, by her own difficult circumstances, to examine honestly and directly what money was actually for, rather than accumulating it reflexively, without ever asking the question. There's one final encounter worth including from that formative year, this one taking place closer to the end of his travels. In a bustling hostel common room filled with other long-term travelers, many of them younger than he was, several of them living what they proudly called a location-independent lifestyle, working remotely from wherever happened to be cheapest or most scenic at any given moment. Vitug initially found himself drawn to their apparent freedom, the ability to earn a living while moving constantly between countries, unburdened by any fixed address or traditional career structure. And for a brief stretch, he wondered whether this specific lifestyle might be the actual answer he'd been searching for throughout his entire trip. But the longer he sat with these conversations, the more he noticed something underneath the surface of their apparent freedom, a different kind of exhaustion, a constant low-grade instability. Friendships, when everyone around them was perpetually in transit, difficulty building any of the community-based financial support he'd witnessed so powerfully back at his credit union, and in some cases, a persistent, nagging uncertainty about their own long-term financial protection, having traded the stability he'd grown up valuing for a freedom that came with its own distinct, often unacknowledged costs. This encounter added an important, nuancing layer to everything else he'd been learning throughout the trip, a recognition that no single lifestyle, whether the traditional, stable path his parents had modeled, or the location-independent freedom these fellow travelers had embraced, represented some universal, correct answer applicable to everyone equally. Each path came with its own specific trade-offs, its own specific alignment or misalignment with any particular individual's honestly examined values, reinforcing once again that the actual work was never about finding the single correct lifestyle template to copy from someone else, but about examining your own specific values honestly enough to determine which trade-offs you were genuinely willing to accept and which ones you weren't. He describes the return itself as almost harder than the departure had been, landing back in the United States after a year away, greeted by well-meaning friends and family members who mostly wanted to know one thing: what was his plan now? When would he be getting back to a real job, back to the kind of stability everyone around him, still, understandably, considered the only sensible marker of having one's life together? He remembers sitting at a family gathering shortly after returning, watching relatives compare notes on career advancement, on home renovations, on retirement accounts, the exact same conversations he'd participated in comfortably for years before he left, and feeling, for the first time, like an outsider to a conversation he'd once been fully fluent in, not because he'd rejected the value of stability itself, but because he could no longer participate in that conversation without silently asking the question underneath it: stability in service of what exactly, and toward whose examined definition of a life worth living? This discomfort, uncomfortable as it genuinely was, became productive rather than paralyzing because it forced him to actually articulate out loud to people who loved him and were genuinely worried about him exactly what he'd learned and why it mattered. The framework considerably more than simply thinking about it privately ever could have. Somewhere during that year, walking through unfamiliar streets, having conversations with people whose entire relationship with money looked nothing like his own family, and nothing like the professional world he'd left behind, Vitug began developing the framework that would eventually become the foundation of everything he'd go on to teach, something he came to call financial wellness, deliberately distinct from the more commonly used term, financial success. When Vitug eventually returned from that year of travel, he didn't return to the same desk in New Jersey, and he didn't return with a tidy, fully formed answer either, only a growing conviction that whatever came next needed to somehow honor what he'd witnessed across those 12 months, who'd starved her own experience of life, chasing an impressive salary, the retiree who'd waited too long, the elderly survivor who understood money's true purpose more clearly than almost anyone he'd met in his professional career, and the quiet, persistent gap he'd noticed for years between financial success and something deeper that so many financially successful people around him still seemed to be missing. He began writing, slowly at first, capturing the framework that had been forming in his mind throughout his travels, eventually building an entire platform around it, one specifically designed to help people examine their own relationship with money, the same way he'd been forced to examine his own, not through abstract financial theory, but through honest, personal reflection, paired with concrete, practical action. He named this platform Frugal, and it grew, gradually, into something considerably larger than a personal project, becoming a resource for exactly the kind of people he'd once sat across from at that credit union desk, people whose actual struggle was rarely about a lack of financial knowledge in the technical sense, and almost always about an unexamined relationship with money inherited long before they'd ever earned a single paycheck of their own. This is why his eventual book carries the title it does, a deliberate reclamation of a phrase that had, by the time he wrote it, already been thoroughly hijacked by a culture of impulsive, reckless spending, an attempt to hand the phrase back its original, more demanding meaning. Examine this one, life, honestly, and build something deliberate with the time and resources you actually have, rather than simply using the phrase as permission to avoid that harder, more meaningful work altogether. Here's the distinction, and it's worth sitting with directly, because it reframes the entire conversation we're about to have. Financial success, as most people understand it, is usually measured externally: income, net worth, the size of your savings account, the value of your home, numbers that can be compared against other people's numbers, ranked, judged, competed over, displayed, whether intentionally or not, in the choices we make about where we live, what we drive, what we post, what we mention casually in conversation. Financial wellness, in Vitug's specific framing, is measured internally, whether your relationship with money genuinely supports the actual life you want to live, whether your spending, saving, and daily financial choices are aligned with your own honestly examined values rather than someone else's definition of what a successful life is supposed to look like. You can, according to this framework, have considerable financial success by external measures and still experience genuinely poor financial wellness, exactly the way Vitug himself did, sitting at that stable, well-paying desk job, feeling quietly hollow despite every external marker suggesting he should have felt secure and satisfied. And, just as importantly, you can build genuine financial wellness at a modest income if your relationship with the money you do have is honest, intentional, and aligned with what actually matters to you, exactly the way that small business owner had, deliberately choosing enough rather than endlessly chasing more. There's a specific way Vitug likes to illustrate this distinction, one worth sitting with directly, because it clarifies something easy to misunderstand at first. Imagine two people with identical net worth, identical income, identical investment portfolios, on paper indistinguishable from one another to any outside observer, any accountant, any bank statement. One of them checks their accounts constantly, feels a persistent unease about whether they're doing enough, saving enough, earning enough, comparing their own numbers reflexively against colleagues, neighbors, or strangers online, and privately suspects, despite the objectively strong numbers, that they're still somehow falling behind. The other looks at those same identical numbers and feels something entirely different. Their day, same numbers, completely different experience of those numbers. This is precisely the gap financial wellness is meant to address, a gap that no amount of additional income or additional savings can close on its own, because the discomfort isn't actually coming from the numbers themselves. It's coming from an unexamined relationship to those numbers, an inherited story running quietly in the background, whispering that whatever currently exists is somehow insufficient, regardless of what the actual figures say. Vitug argues that most conventional financial advice focuses almost exclusively on improving the numbers themselves, earn more, save more, invest more efficiently, while almost entirely ignoring this second, arguably more important layer, the actual felt experience of living inside whatever financial reality you've already built. Now let's talk about a concept Vitug returns to repeatedly throughout his work, something he calls your money story, because understanding it is the essential first step in his entire framework, and it deserves real, careful attention, because it's more layered than it first appears. Your money story, in his specific definition, is the collection of beliefs, memories, and lessons you absorbed about money, usually starting in early childhood, often without ever consciously examining them, that continue shaping your financial decisions well into adulthood, whether or not those beliefs still actually serve you. For Vitug personally, his money story was deeply tied to his family's immigrant experience, a narrative built around stability as the ultimate goal, security as the highest priority, and a certain quiet discomfort around risk, around deviating from a predictable, well-worn path, a discomfort he could trace directly back to watching his parents work so hard to build something stable, something that could never be casually risked or gambled away. Recognizing this story clearly during that pivotal year of travel allowed him to start asking a question most people never think to ask directly. Was this specific definition of success, the one he'd absorbed without ever consciously choosing it, actually his own, or was it simply the story he'd inherited, one that had served his parents well in their own specific circumstances, but that might not actually reflect what he, personally, genuinely valued in his own life, in his own specific circumstances? Decades later, in a completely different country, at a completely different stage of life. There's an illustrative example worth walking through here, the kind of pattern Vitug describes seeing constantly in his work, helping people examine their own money stories, a pattern built around silence rather than scarcity. Picture someone raised in a household where financial conversations were rare, where money was treated as something private, almost taboo, discussed only in hushed, anxious tones when something had gone wrong, a topic that surfaced only during arguments behind closed doors, never during ordinary, daily conversation. Growing up inside that silence, this person absorbed a specific, unspoken lesson, childhood kitchen, where the topic had always felt vaguely dangerous. Decades later, despite genuinely comfortable earnings, this person still felt a persistent unease around anything involving money, with their own spouse, not because the actual numbers were troubling, but because the old inherited script, money is private, anxious, something to avoid discussing directly, was still quietly running in the background of every financial decision they made, decades after the original source of that lesson had faded into distant memory. Only once this pattern was named directly, examined honestly, could it actually begin to shift, replaced gradually with a more intentional, more examined relationship with money, one chosen consciously rather than simply inherited by default, one that involved, uncomfortably at first actually, opening those statements, actually discussing finances openly with a partner, actually treating money as a normal, discussable part of an adult life rather than a source of private, unspoken anxiety. There's a second pattern worth walking through, one built not around silence, but around a different inherited belief entirely, one centered on status rather than security. Picture someone raised in a household where financial success was measured almost entirely by visible markers: the car in the driveway, the size of the home, the brand names worn to family gatherings, where conversations about money almost always circled back, directly or indirectly, to comparisons with neighbors, relatives, or acquaintances, whoever happened to be doing slightly better or slightly worse at any given moment. Growing up inside that environment, this person absorbed a lesson that had nothing to do with genuine security or genuine values, and everything to do with appearance, quietly watching and judging. As an adult, despite genuinely modest actual financial needs, this person found themselves consistently drawn toward visible, status-signaling purchases, upgrading vehicles more frequently than necessary, choosing a larger home than their actual living needs required, purely because the inherited script equated financial worth with visible display, rather than with any honestly examined internal sense of what actually mattered to them. Once this specific pattern was named and examined honestly, this person was able to begin separating genuine desire from inherited compulsion, asking, before each significant purchase, whether it reflected something they actually valued, or whether it was simply satisfying an old, inherited need to be seen a certain way by people whose opinions, upon honest reflection, mattered far less to their actual daily happiness than the inherited script had always insisted they should. There's a third pattern worth walking through, one Vitug describes encountering constantly among people who otherwise seem financially responsible, thoughtful, even generous, a pattern built not around silence or status, but around a quiet, persistent sense of undeservingness. Picture someone raised in a household where any request for something beyond the strict basics was met with a specific kind of guilt, not outright refusal exactly, but a heavy sigh, a comment about how hard everyone else was working, beyond the absolute necessities, was somehow selfish, somehow a betrayal of the family's collective struggle. Growing up inside that particular emotional weather, this person absorbed a lesson that had nothing to do with actual scarcity and everything to do with worthiness, that enjoying money, spending it on genuine pleasure or comfort, required a kind of permission that never quite felt available, even decades later, even once they were earning considerably more than their own parents ever had. As an adult, this person found themselves capable of great generosity toward others, comfortable spending freely on family, on friends, on causes they believed in, while remaining almost pathologically unable to spend anything meaningful on themselves, treating their own comfort and pleasure as, somehow, less legitimate, less deserving of the same careful, generous attention they extended so easily to everyone else in their life. Naming this pattern directly, Vitug notes, is often one of the more emotionally difficult parts of examining a money story, because it requires confronting not just a belief about money itself, but a much deeper belief about one's own worthiness, one's own right to occupy space, to take up resources, to enjoy the fruits of one's own labor without needing to justify that enjoyment against some invisible ledger of collective sacrifice. There's a fourth pattern, distinct from all three already discussed, one built specifically around fear of loss rather than fear of insufficiency, a pattern that tends to show up most visibly in people who have actually experienced a significant financial setback at some point in their own adult lives. Rather than simply inheriting a story from childhood, picture someone who built a genuinely comfortable financial position through years of careful, steady work, only to watch a significant portion of it disappear during an unexpected downturn, a market collapse, a business failure, a sudden, unforeseen expense that arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Even after eventually rebuilding much of what was lost, this person often carries forward a specific, heightened vigilance and inability to ever fully relax financially again, checking accounts obsessively, avoiding any decision that carries even modest uncertainty, treating every financial choice as a potential repeat of that original, painful loss, regardless of how genuinely different their current circumstances actually are. This particular money story, Vitug notes, can be especially difficult to examine honestly, because unlike an inherited belief absorbed secondhand from a parent's anxious tone of voice, like hard-won wisdom that simply happens to be true, even when, upon honest reflection, it's actually preventing the person from making decisions that would genuinely serve their current, actual circumstances. This is precisely the work. You cannot build genuine financial wellness on top of an unexamined money story, because that old story, whatever its specific content happens to be, scarcity, secrecy, status, fear, will keep quietly steering your decisions, regardless of how sound any specific strategy layered on top of it might technically be. Here's a pause worth taking right now, honestly, with nobody else watching. What's the earliest memory you have involving money, and what did that specific memory teach you, without anyone ever directly saying it out loud, about what money means and what having it or not having it says about a person's worth? It's worth noting, before moving forward, that most people don't fit neatly into just one of these four patterns: silence, status, undeservingness, or fear of loss. Vitug describes encountering countless variations and combinations across his years of work, someone carrying both a silence-based upbringing and a later, adult experience of genuine financial loss, compounding into a particularly stubborn combination of avoidance and hypervigilance, or someone raised amid visible status competition who later experienced a period of real hardship, producing a confusing, sometimes contradictory mix of impulses, wanting desperately to display success while simultaneously fearing, at a deeper level, that any of it could vanish overnight. The specific combination matters less than the underlying practice itself, the willingness to sit down, honestly, without judgment, and trace your own particular pattern back to its actual origin, rather than simply accepting your current financial behavior as some fixed, unchangeable feature of your personality, when it's very often nothing more than an old, inherited script that has simply never been questioned directly. Now let's talk about how Vitug's framework moves from this internal examination toward something genuinely practical, because financial wellness, in his teaching, isn't simply a philosophical exercise. It's built around specific, distinct dimensions of your financial life, each one requiring honest attention, rather than assuming that focusing exclusively on one dimension, say, aggressive saving, automatically means the others are being handled well too. Before walking through each of these 6 dimensions individually, it's worth pausing on something that sits underneath all of them simultaneously, connecting directly back to the idea of financial confidence we touched on briefly a moment ago, because attempting to overhaul all 6 dimensions at once, immediately, dramatically, tends to backfire for most people in exactly the same way any sweeping, immediate lifestyle overhaul usually does. Vitug encourages a considerably gentler entry point, identifying honestly which single dimension currently feels most neglected, most disconnected from genuine, examined values, and beginning there specifically, allowing a handful of small, successful adjustments in that one area to build the kind of confidence and momentum that makes tackling the remaining dimensions feel considerably less daunting. There's a story worth including here of someone who, upon first encountering this entire framework, felt immediately overwhelmed, recognizing gaps in nearly every single dimension simultaneously, spending disconnected from genuine values, saving undifferentiated and vague, sharing almost entirely absent, earning driven by inherited guilt rather than examined choice, protection incomplete, and planning non-existent beyond a passive retirement contribution deducted automatically from each paycheck. Rather than attempting to address all six at once, an approach that would very likely have collapsed under its own weight within a matter of weeks. Contribution toward a single cause they genuinely cared about, that one small, successful adjustment, sustained consistently for several months, built enough confidence and enough positive momentum that tackling the next dimension, naming specific savings goals rather than leaving everything undifferentiated, felt considerably less intimidating than it would have felt as the very first step in an already overwhelming process. Let's walk through each of these dimensions carefully, one at a time, because each deserves genuine, dedicated attention, rather than a quick summary that risks flattening what's actually a fairly nuanced, interconnected system. The first dimension involves how you spend, and Vitug's specific insight here echoes something we've touched on throughout this entire discussion. Spending itself isn't the problem. Unexamined spending, disconnected from your own honestly identified values, is the actual problem. Whether that spending is excessive, driven by comparison, or old emotional wounds, or whether it's excessively restricted, driven by inherited fear rather than genuine, deliberate choice. There's an illustrative example worth sitting with here. Someone who, after finally examining their own spending honestly for the first time in years, discovered that a meaningful portion of their monthly budget went toward a category they eventually labeled simply as forgetting subscriptions they'd signed up for and never used, memberships maintained purely out of inertia, small recurring charges that had accumulated so gradually they'd never actually registered as a conscious choice at all. Once identified clearly, this person redirected that same amount of money toward something they genuinely wanted to do for years, spent unconsciously, produced a dramatically different sense of satisfaction. There's a second story worth including in this same dimension, involving someone on the opposite end of the spectrum, someone who had internalized such a strict, unexamined discipline around spending that they'd stopped allowing themselves nearly any discretionary purchases at all, treating every non-essential expense as evidence of weakness or irresponsibility. When this person finally sat down and honestly examined their own spending against their own stated values, rather than against some abstract, borrowed standard of frugality, they discovered something uncomfortable, needed, having absorbed, without anyone ever explicitly teaching it, that any request involving money would be met with visible tension or reluctance, an inherited pattern eerily similar to the very silence-based money story we explored earlier, now being passed down, unintentionally, to yet another generation. Recognizing that, the person made a deliberate, examined decision to loosen certain spending categories specifically related to family experiences and shared time, not abandoning discipline altogether, but redirecting it more intentionally, distinguishing between spending that reflected genuine values, connection, experience, shared memory, and spending that had simply become restrictive out of old habit rather than honest necessity. The second dimension involves how you save, and here, Vitug pushes back gently against the idea that saving is automatically virtuous regardless of its purpose. Saving without a clear, honestly examined reason, simply accumulating a larger number because a larger number feels inherently safer, can become just as disconnected from genuine well-being as reckless spending. Exactly the pattern we explored earlier, with people who defer every joy indefinitely, without ever actually examining what they're saving toward or why. There's a specific practice Vitug encourages here, one worth adopting directly, giving each specific savings goal an actual name and purpose, rather than allowing all savings to blend together into one undifferentiated, anxious pile labeled simply as safety. A fund specifically for visiting family abroad, a fund specifically for a career transition someday, a fund specifically for genuine emergencies. Each one named, each one tracked separately, transforms saving from a vague, joyless obligation into a series of concrete, purposeful commitments toward things that genuinely matter. There's a related story worth including here, involving a couple who had spent years saving diligently toward a single, undifferentiated goal they simply called the future, a vague, distant target that neither of them could describe with any real specificity when directly asked what it actually contained. When they finally sat down together and named their savings specifically, a portion for a home in a location they'd both genuinely discussed and wanted, a portion for their children's education, a portion for the kind of slower, more flexible work life they hoped to build in their 50s, something shifted in how saving itself felt to both of them, transforming from a source of quiet, ongoing anxiety about an undefined future into a series of concrete, motivating targets they could actually track, celebrate, and feel genuine progress toward, rather than simply watching a single number grow, without any clear sense of what it was actually protecting or building toward. The third dimension involves sharing, giving generously to people, and causes that genuinely matter to you, something Vitug treats as an essential part of financial wellness, not an optional add-on, reserved only for people who've already achieved some arbitrary level of personal financial security. First, his own credit union background shaped this piece of his philosophy directly. Having spent years inside an institution built specifically around the idea of community-based finance, members pooling resources to support one another rather than the more transactional, individually optimized relationship most people have with traditional banking. There's a story worth sharing here of a modest earner who nonetheless committed to setting aside a small, consistent percentage of every paycheck specifically for giving, sometimes to family members going through a difficult stretch, sometimes to a local organization whose work genuinely resonated with them, describing this practice as one of the most reliably satisfying financial habits they'd ever built. More consistently meaningful, they noted. There's a second dimension to sharing worth mentioning as well, one that goes beyond direct financial giving, involving the way money moves through entire communities rather than simply between individuals, something Vitug witnessed directly during his credit union years, watching a small group of members pool resources informally to help a fellow member through a difficult stretch, not through any formal charitable structure, but simply through the quiet, mutual understanding that comes from belonging to the same tightly connected community over many years. This kind of communal sharing, Vitug argues, tends to atrophy in more individualistic, transactional financial environments, where every relationship with money becomes purely personal, purely private, disconnected from any broader sense of mutual obligation or support, and part of his broader teaching involves actively working to rebuild these kinds of connections, whether through formal community organizations, informal mutual aid among friends, or simply a more open, less private approach to discussing financial struggle with the people closest to you. The fourth dimension involves how you earn, encouraging honest reflection on whether your current work, your current source of income, actually aligns with your own values and strengths, or whether it's simply the path that seemed safest, most expected, most aligned with an inherited money story, rather than your own genuinely examined priorities. This dimension connects directly back to Vitug's own story, sitting at that desk in New Jersey, technically earning well, technically succeeding by every external measure, and yet feeling a persistent disconnect between his daily work and anything he could honestly identify as genuinely meaningful to him. There's a broader nuance worth adding here, because Vitug is careful never to suggest that everyone must find work that feels constantly passionate or deeply fulfilling in every single moment, an unrealistic standard that itself risks becoming just another inherited, unexamined expectation. Instead, the dimension of earning asks a more modest, more honest question: whether your current work provides enough alignment with your own values and strengths that it doesn't require you to quietly abandon large parts of who you are for the majority of your waking hours, and whether the income it provides is being used deliberately in service of the rest of your examined life, rather than simply consumed reflexively as compensation for hours spent somewhere that felt like a compromise from the very beginning. There's a story worth including here of someone who never actually changed careers at all, remaining in the exact same profession for decades, but who fundamentally shifted their relationship to that work once they recognized it as one dimension among six, rather than the sole source of their entire identity and self-worth, redirecting the energy they previously poured entirely into career advancement toward a more balanced investment across saving, sharing, and genuine connection, discovering that the job itself became considerably more tolerable once it was no longer being asked to provide everything meaningful in their life all on its own. The fifth dimension involves how you protect what you've built: insurance, emergency planning, the practical safeguards that allow you to weather life's inevitable disruptions without those disruptions completely derailing everything else you've worked toward. There's a story worth including here of someone who had otherwise built genuinely strong habits across every other dimension: thoughtful spending, purposeful saving, generous sharing, meaningful work, and yet had never gotten around to establishing even a basic emergency fund, assuming, somewhat naively, that their overall financial discipline would simply carry them through whatever unexpected difficulty eventually arose. When a sudden medical expense arrived unexpectedly, this person found themselves forced to interrupt years of careful progress in every other dimension, pulling money out of long-term savings earmarked for entirely different purposes, precisely because this one dimension, protection, had been quietly neglected, while attention remained focused on the other five. There's a second story worth including here, involving someone who had, on the surface, handled protection reasonably well, maintaining adequate insurance coverage, a modest emergency fund, the basic checklist items most financial guidance emphasizes. But when Vitug dug slightly deeper with this particular person, he discovered a gap that rarely gets discussed as explicitly as it deserves: an absence of any clear plan for who would actually make financial decisions on their behalf if they were ever unable to make those decisions themselves. No documented wishes, no designated authority, nothing beyond a vague assumption that family members would simply figure it out if the need ever arose. This gap, Vitug notes, tends to hide in plain sight precisely because it requires confronting mortality and incapacity directly, topics most people instinctively avoid. Even when avoiding them leaves the people they love most vulnerable to exactly the kind of confusion, conflict, and unnecessary hardship that a small amount of honest, upfront planning could have prevented entirely. He often points out the quiet irony in this particular gap, that people who have otherwise done considerable work examining their own money story aligning their spending with genuine values, and building thoughtful, purposeful savings goals will nonetheless avoid this single, specific conversation precisely because it requires imagining a version of the future that involves their own vulnerability or absence, a task considerably more emotionally demanding than any budgeting spreadsheet or investment allocation ever could be. Addressing it doesn't require elaborate legal machinery in every case. Sometimes it simply requires a single honest conversation with a spouse, a sibling, or an adult child, naming clearly who should be trusted to make decisions and what those decisions should reflect, converting an unspoken, uncomfortable assumption into an explicit, documented understanding that spares the people left behind from having to guess, often during an already difficult moment, what would have actually been wanted. And the sixth dimension involves how you plan for the future, not in the sense of rigid, joyless deprivation we explored earlier, but in the sense of intentional, values, aligned preparation, ensuring your future self has the resources needed to continue living according to whatever you've honestly identified as genuinely mattering to you. There's a story worth including in this final dimension as well, involving someone who had spent years assuming that planning for the future simply meant contributing consistently to a retirement account and otherwise not thinking about it very much, treating the entire subject as something to be handled passively on autopilot rather than examined periodically and deliberately. When this person finally sat down and projected forward honestly, imagining specific, concrete versions of their own life, benchmarks didn't actually account for something they cared about deeply: the desire to spend an extended period of time each year near aging family members living in another country, a genuine value that required specific planning, specific flexibility, specific financial structuring. Passive, autopilot approach to retirement saving had never once considered. Adjusting their plan to explicitly include this specific, honestly identified value transformed planning from an abstract, distant obligation into something considerably more alive, more connected to an actual, envisioned future, rather than a vague placeholder labeled simply as someday. Here's why Vitug insists on examining all 6 of these dimensions together, rather than allowing strength in one area to compensate for neglect in the others. Someone can be an excellent saver while completely neglecting genuine connection through sharing and giving. Someone can earn an impressive income while remaining in work that slowly, quietly drains their sense of purpose and meaning. Someone can spend thoughtfully and generously while leaving themselves completely unprotected against a single unexpected setback that could undo years of careful progress. Genuine financial wellness, in this framework, requires honest attention across all 6 dimensions simultaneously, rather than excelling in whichever single area happens to feel most comfortable or familiar, while quietly ignoring the rest. Vitug sometimes describes these 6 dimensions using the image of a wheel, each one a distinct spoke, and argues that a wheel with 5 strong spokes and 1 badly weakened one doesn't roll smoothly at all. Dimensions, and 1 badly neglected one tends to produce a persistent, hard-to-diagnose sense that something is off, even when most of the visible indicators look perfectly fine. This image matters because it explains why so many people who appear, by every conventional measure, to be doing well financially, still report the same quiet dissatisfaction Vitug himself felt at that desk in New Jersey, a dissatisfaction that resists easy explanation precisely because it isn't rooted in any single obvious failure, but in an imbalance across a system most people have never been taught to examine as an interconnected whole in the first place. It also explains why the specific order in which someone addresses these dimensions matters less than the honest, complete examination itself. because a wheel doesn't need every spoke reinforced in some particular sequence. It simply needs every spoke eventually strong enough to bear its share of the weight, whatever order that strengthening happens to occur in. Now, let's return to that phrase we opened this entire story with. You only live once. Because Vitug's own journey directly reshapes what this phrase is actually meant to mean. For the year he spent traveling, stepping outside the predictable script his own money story had quietly written for him, he wasn't chasing reckless, impulsive spending, exactly the trap that phrase has come to represent for so many people scrolling through curated images of other people's spontaneous adventures. He was doing something considerably more deliberate, examining, honestly, for the first time in his adult life, what he actually wanted his one life to look like, rather than simply continuing to follow instructions absorbed decades earlier without ever consciously choosing them. This is the actual meaning underneath the phrase. Once you strip away the reckless, impulsive connotation an entire generation has attached to it, you only live once means you don't get an infinite number of attempts to figure out what genuinely matters to you. It means the stability your parents, or your culture, or your own inherited money story insists you should be chasing might not actually be the same thing as the life you choose, honestly, deliberately, if you took the time to examine what you actually want, rather than simply inheriting someone else's definition by default. And it means that examining this honestly and then building your financial life deliberately around whatever you discover, spending, saving, sharing, earning, protecting, and planning, all aligned with genuinely examined values rather than inherited assumptions, is precisely what living this one life fully actually requires. There's a broader idea worth sitting with here, one that Vitug returns to often when describing the ultimate purpose behind this entire framework: the notion that financial wellness was never meant to be the final destination at all, but rather a foundation, a stable, examined base from which a person becomes genuinely free to pursue whatever they consider their actual purpose to be. Money, in this view, isn't the goal. It's the infrastructure, the plumbing and wiring underneath a life, invisible when functioning well, disruptive and impossible to ignore when neglected or misaligned, but never, in itself, the actual point of the entire structure. This distinction matters because it reframes an anxiety many people carry silently, the fear that focusing on money at all, examining it, planning around it, building deliberate systems for it, is somehow a shallow, materialistic pursuit, a distraction from more meaningful, more spiritual, more purposeful concern. Vitug's answer to this concern is direct and, in its own way, genuinely liberating. Ignoring your relationship with money doesn't make you more purposeful or more spiritually evolved. It simply means your inherited, unexamined money story continues operating quietly in the background, shaping your decisions anyway, just without your conscious awareness or consent. Exactly the way it shaped his own decision to remain at that desk in New Jersey for years longer than actually served him, and exactly the way it shaped that son's decision to remain in an exhausting career out of unexamined guilt toward his own father's sacrifice. Examining money honestly, in other words, isn't a distraction from a purposeful life. It's very often the exact prerequisite required to actually build one, clearing away the inherited noise and unconscious fear that would otherwise quietly steer your decisions, regardless of whatever deeper purpose you consciously believe yourself to be pursuing. There's a story worth walking through here, illustrating exactly how this framework plays out for someone applying it to their own specific circumstances in far more gradual, far less dramatic terms than quitting a job entirely and traveling the world for a year. Picture a woman working in a stable, respected profession, one her own family had encouraged enthusiastically for years, who nonetheless felt a persistent, quiet dissatisfaction she couldn't fully explain to anyone around her. a familiar echo of exactly what Vitug himself once felt at that same desk. In New Jersey, working through this framework honestly, she realized her own money story had been built almost entirely around external validation, choosing a respected career path specifically because it would make her family proud, rather than because it genuinely reflected her own interests or strengths. An inherited script nearly identical to the one Vitug himself eventually had to examine and question. Rather than abandoning everything abruptly, she began making smaller, deliberate adjustments, redirecting a portion of her savings toward developing skills in an entirely different field she'd always been quietly curious about, treating that specific spending not as reckless or irresponsible, but as a direct, deliberate investment in a version of earning. Over the following 2 years, she gradually transitioned into work that felt considerably more aligned with what she'd honestly identified as mattering to her, while maintaining the financial stability and protection her earlier, more traditional path had already established, proving that this kind of examined, values-driven change doesn't necessarily require the same dramatic leap Vitug himself eventually took. This is exactly the kind of deliberate, examined decision making Vitug's entire framework is built to support, neither reckless abandonment of stability nor rigid, unexamined adherence to an inherited path that no longer genuinely serves the person living inside it. Before moving further, there's one more area worth exploring directly, because it touches nearly everyone listening to this in some form, whether married, partnered, or navigating shared finances with family members, and it connects every single dimension we've just walked through into something considerably more complicated than any individual's private relationship with money alone. Money stories rarely exist in isolation, and Vitug spends considerable attention on what happens when two people, each carrying their own distinct, often unexamined money story, attempt to build a shared financial life together without ever fully surfacing those underlying stories to each other directly. Remember that young couple from earlier, sitting stiffly on opposite sides of his desk, one wanting to save aggressively for a home, the other wanting to spend more freely on experiences while they were still young. What Vitug eventually helped them see wasn't that one of them was right and the other wrong, but that each of them was operating from a completely different inherited money story, one shaped by a household where financial disaster had struck unexpectedly and left a lasting fear of being caught unprepared, the other shaped by a household where nothing had ever quite gone wrong financially, leaving a comparatively relaxed, present-focused relationship with spending that had simply never been tested by real hardship. Neither story was inherently better than the other, but neither partner had ever actually named their own story explicitly to the other, meaning every disagreement about money played out as a surface-level argument about a specific purchase or a specific savings target, when the actual disagreement was happening at a much deeper level between two entirely different, unexamined belief systems about what money is fundamentally for and what it protects against. Once each partner named their own money story honestly in front of the other, something shifted in how they approached every subsequent financial conversation, no longer defending a specific number or a specific purchase in isolation, but acknowledging openly which underlying fear or value was actually driving each position, allowing them to build something neither person's original story alone could have produced, a shared, examined approach that honored both the need for security and the need for genuine, present enjoyment of their one shared life together. This same dynamic, Vitug notes, plays out just as powerfully between adult siblings navigating an aging parent's finances, between business partners building a company together, and between parents and adult children navigating questions of support, inheritance, or shared financial obligation. Any relationship, in other words, where more than one person's money story is quietly operating in the same shared financial space, whether or not anyone has ever paused to actually name what those individual stories are. There's one more layer to this worth exploring directly, because it connects back to something Vitug clearly cares about on a deeply personal level, the question of what gets passed down, deliberately or otherwise, to the next generation. He often points out that most parents spend considerable energy teaching their children specific financial mechanics, how to open a savings account, perhaps the basics of a budget, occasionally even simple investing concepts, while almost never addressing the underlying money story those same children are simultaneously absorbing simply by watching how their parents actually behave around money day to day. A parent who teaches careful budgeting while visibly, chronically anxious every time a bill arrives is teaching two lessons simultaneously, one explicit and mechanical, one implicit and emotional, and Vitug argues the implicit lesson very often overrides the explicit one entirely, regardless of how technically sound the mechanical instruction happens to be. This is precisely why examining your own money story matters beyond your own individual well-being, because whatever remains unexamined in your own relationship with money is very likely already being absorbed, quietly, by anyone watching you closely enough, children especially, who tend to notice far more about their parents' actual emotional relationship with money than any parent typically realizes or intends. There's a story worth including here of a woman who, having done this exact work on her own money story, deliberately began narrating her financial decisions out loud in front of her children, not the anxious, hushed tones she'd grown up with herself, but calm, transparent explanations why she was choosing to save toward a specific goal, why a particular purchase felt worth it to her and another didn't, treating money as a normal, openly discussable part of family life, rather than a source of private tension reserved for closed-door conversation. Years later, her own children described feeling a noticeably different relationship with money than most of their peers, not because they'd received any different mechanical education, but because they'd absorbed a fundamentally different implicit lesson, examined thoughtfully, and aligned deliberately with what actually mattered, rather than treated as a source of private anxiety to be managed quietly and never openly acknowledged. Now let's talk about something Vitug emphasizes directly, connecting back to his own credit union background, something worth understanding clearly because it challenges a common assumption about how financial institutions are supposed to work. He argues that community-oriented financial institutions, ones built around mutual support rather than pure profit maximization, often better serve genuine financial wellness than institutions purely focused on transactional efficiency, because they are structurally oriented around the actual well-being of their members, rather than purely around extracting maximum value from each individual customer relationship. This isn't presented as a rigid rule applying to every single financial decision, but as a broader principle worth considering, evaluating not just the interest rate or the convenience of any particular financial product, but the underlying philosophy and incentive structure of the institution you're choosing to trust with your money in the first place. Before returning to his credit union years directly, it's worth pausing on a related idea that runs quietly underneath nearly everything we've explored so far, something Vitug frames as a fundamental orientation, it or not, the difference between an abundance mindset and a scarcity mindset. A scarcity mindset, in this framing, treats money as a fundamentally limited, threatened resource, something that could run out at any moment, something that must be hoarded, defended, and never risked unnecessarily, an orientation that, as we've already seen, can develop just as easily in someone who has genuinely experienced hardship as in someone who simply absorbed that fear secondhand from an anxious household. regardless of their own actual current circumstances. An abundance mindset, by contrast, doesn't mean naively assuming money will always simply appear when needed, or ignoring genuine financial risk altogether. It means approaching your financial life from a foundation of trust in your own capability, your own resourcefulness, and your own ability to adapt and recover from setbacks, rather than approaching every decision from a place of fear, defensiveness, or anxious vigilance. Vitug describes noticing this distinction constantly during his travels, watching people with genuinely modest resources make decisions rooted in generosity, warmth, and open-handedness. The family who shared their evening meal without hesitation, the elderly woman who'd survived genuine hardship, and yet spoke of money without bitterness or fear, while simultaneously watching people with considerably greater material wealth make decisions rooted almost entirely in anxious defensiveness, hoarding, comparison, and a persistent nagging sense that whatever they currently had could never quite be enough. This isn't a simple, tidy correlation, and Vitug is careful never to suggest that wealth itself causes scarcity thinking, or that material hardship automatically produces abundance thinking, because he encountered plenty of exceptions to both patterns throughout his travels and his professional career alike. But he does argue that the specific mindset a person carries, examined honestly, tends to matter more for their actual, felt experience of financial well-being than the specific numbers in their accounts, echoing directly the distinction we explored earlier between two people holding identical net worth and experiencing that identical number in dramatically different ways. Shifting from a scarcity mindset toward an abundance mindset, Vitug suggests, doesn't happen through simple willpower or positive thinking alone. It happens gradually, through the same process of honest examination we've walked through across this entire discussion, naming your own inherited money story directly, examining each of the 6 dimensions honestly and slowly, deliberately, making choices that reflect trust and genuine values, rather than reflexive fear, one specific decision at a time, until that accumulated pattern of choices begins to feel, eventually, like a new and more settled default, rather than a constant, effortful override of an old, anxious instinct. There's a specific, small practice Vitug suggests for building this shift gradually, one worth mentioning directly because of how deceptively simple it sounds against how genuinely effective people tend to find it once they actually try it consistently. At the end of each day or each week, pause briefly and note one specific instance where money supported something you genuinely valued, a meal shared with someone you love, a bill paid that protected your family's stability, a small contribution given to a cause that matters to you, a modest purchase that brought real, honest enjoyment rather than fleeting, comparison-driven satisfaction. This isn't about ignoring genuine financial stress or pretending difficulties don't exist, and Vitug is careful never to suggest that abundance thinking means denying real constraints or genuine hardship when they're actually present. It's about deliberately, consistently noticing the ways money is already, quietly, functioning as a tool in service of what you value, building evidence over time against an old inherited narrative, substantial enough, eventually, to genuinely shift the underlying orientation a person carries into every subsequent financial decision they make. There's a specific memory Vitug returns to from his own credit union years, watching a member who'd fallen behind on payments during a genuinely difficult stretch, a job loss, a family emergency, be treated not as a statistic to be efficiently processed, but as a person, a member of the same community, someone the institution had a genuine stake in helping through a temporary hardship rather than simply penalizing. That experience stayed with him long after he left that specific role, informing everything he'd eventually go on to teach about the difference between institutions built around genuine wellness and institutions built around pure, impersonal efficiency, a distinction that, he came to believe, mirrors the exact distinction between financial success and financial wellness at the individual level as well. There's a second memory worth including here, one that illustrates the same principle from a slightly different angle, involving a young member who came in seeking her very first loan, nervous, uncertain, clearly unfamiliar with the terminology and the process, having grown up in a household where nobody had ever walked her through how credit or interest or repayment terms actually worked in any real detail. Rather than simply processing her application efficiently and sending her on her way, the loan officer she worked with, a colleague Vitug deeply respected, spent nearly an hour patiently explaining every single term on the document in plain, accessible language, treating her questions, however basic. They seemed as entirely legitimate rather than a nuisance or an inconvenience standing between the institution and its efficiency targets. That single interaction, Vitug notes, likely did more for that young woman's long-term financial wellness than any specific interest rate or loan term ever could have, because it addressed something the mechanics of the transaction alone never would have touched: her own confidence, her own sense of legitimacy and belonging within a financial system that had, up to that point, felt intimidating and foreign to her. This is precisely why Vitug so often emphasizes financial confidence as a distinct, essential ingredient sitting underneath all 6 dimensions we've already explored, because a person can theoretically understand every concept we've discussed today: spending, saving, sharing, earning, protecting, and planning, and still struggle to actually apply any of it consistently if they don't fundamentally believe they're capable of managing their own financial life competently in the first place. Building that confidence, he argues, rarely happens through abstract education alone, reading articles, watching videos, absorbing concepts intellectually. It happens through exactly the kind of patient, respectful, hands-on interaction that loan officer provided, and through the accumulated experience of actually making small financial decisions successfully, one at a time, gradually replacing an old, inherited sense of intimidation or unfamiliarity with a new, earned sense of genuine capability. Let's bring all of this into the world you're actually living in right now, because the specific pressures Vitug identified, inherited money stories, external validation driving major life decisions, an entire culture pushing predictable, linear paths toward success have arguably intensified since he first began sharing this framework. Social media constantly displays curated versions of both extremes: reckless spending presented as living your best life, and rigid, aggressive saving presented as the only responsible path toward genuine security, making it easy to feel pulled toward one extreme or the other without ever pausing to examine your own specific money story or your own genuinely held values, honestly and directly. The pace of modern life, constant notifications, constant comparison, constant exposure to other people's curated financial decisions makes the quiet, internal work of examining your own money story considerably harder than it might have been in previous generations, when comparison was limited to the handful of people you actually knew rather than an endless, algorithmically curated stream of strangers. There's a specific modern variation of the scarcity mindset worth naming directly, one Vitug didn't originally encounter in quite this form during his own travels, but one that has since become impossible to ignore: constant, algorithmically amplified exposure to other people's highlight reels, producing a persistent, low-grade sense of falling behind regardless of how objectively secure a person's actual financial position happens to be. This modern pressure tends to distort all 6 dimensions simultaneously, pushing spending toward status-driven purchases disguised as authentic desire, pushing saving toward anxious, undifferentiated hoarding rather than purposeful, named goals, and pushing earning toward an exhausting, comparison-driven treadmill that rarely pauses long enough to ask whether the underlying work still genuinely aligns with anything the person actually values. The specific antidote Vitug points toward isn't withdrawal from modern life altogether, an unrealistic and largely unhelpful suggestion for most people, but rather a deliberate periodic return to the same honest examination we've walked throughout this entire discussion, treating your own money story and your own 6 dimensions as a kind of internal compass, one that needs to be consulted regularly and deliberately, precisely because the surrounding noise has become loud enough and constant enough to otherwise drown it out almost entirely. Here's the modern application worth genuinely acting on this week. Something concrete, something you can actually start today without needing to quit your job or book a flight halfway around the world. Take time, alone, honestly, and try to identify your own money story, the earliest lessons you absorbed about what money means, what having it or not having it says about your worth, and whether those lessons were ever consciously chosen or simply inherited by default from your own family and circumstances. Then, examine your current financial life across each of the 6 dimensions we walked through together: spending, saving, sharing, earning, protecting, and planning, and ask honestly which of these areas has been neglected, quietly overshadowed by whichever single dimension has felt most comfortable or familiar to focus on. Here's a slightly more detailed version of that same exercise, worth walking through carefully, because the specific process matters as much as the intention behind it. Start by writing down, without censoring yourself, the very first memory that comes to mind involving money. Whatever surfaces first, whether it's a specific conversation, ask what that memory seems to be teaching, not what you consciously believe about money today, but what that specific scene, examined honestly, suggests you absorbed at the time, before you had any real ability to question or evaluate it. Then, separately, take each of the 6 dimensions in turn, and give yourself an honest, informal grade, not a rigorous, precise calculation, simply a gut-level sense of whether that particular area feels genuinely aligned with what you value, neglected entirely, or perhaps handled so rigidly that it's become its own kind of imbalance. Notice which dimension you graded most quickly, most confidently, because that's very often the one that's already comfortable, already familiar, already receiving disproportionate attention, precisely because it doesn't require confronting anything uncomfortable. This particular observation, Vitug notes, tends to surprise people more than almost any other part of the exercise, because the dimension that feels most solved, most under control, is very often the exact one a person has been unconsciously using to compensate for genuine discomfort somewhere else entirely. An aggressive saver who has never examined why saving specifically feels so much safer to focus on than the harder, more emotionally exposed work of examining their own earning choices or their own capacity for generosity, or a generous giver who has never turned that same generosity honestly inward toward their own legitimate needs and comfort. And notice which dimension you hesitated over, or perhaps avoided rating honestly at all, because that hesitation itself is usually a meaningful signal, pointing directly toward the specific area of your financial life most in need of honest, deliberate attention. If you share your financial life with a partner, a family member, or anyone else, consider inviting them to do this same exercise separately, and then compare notes honestly, not to determine who's right, but to surface the underlying stories each of you may be carrying, unexamined, into every shared financial decision you make together. Give this entire process real time rather than expecting a single sitting to produce complete clarity across every dimension at once. because the money stories we've walked through today were built slowly, over years, sometimes over decades, and unraveling them honestly, replacing them with something genuinely chosen rather than simply inherited, tends to unfold at a similarly gradual pace. One honest conversation, one small adjustment, one deliberately examined decision at a time, exactly the way it did for Jason Vitug himself, across an entire year of unfamiliar streets and unfamiliar conversations, and across the years of patient, deliberate rebuilding that followed once he finally returned home. Let's walk through one more story, a slightly longer one, because it illustrates how all 6 dimensions and the underlying money story work together in practice, across an actual extended stretch of someone's real financial life, rather than as 6 separate, isolated exercises. There's a man in his early 40s who came across this framework at a moment when, by every external measure, he appeared to be doing exceptionally well. A comfortable income, a home he and his family enjoyed, savings accumulating steadily in the background, exactly as every conventional financial guide suggested they should. And yet he described feeling a persistent, low-grade dissatisfaction he couldn't quite name, a sense that despite doing everything he'd been told was responsible, something essential was still missing from how he actually experienced his own financial life day to day. Working backward through his own money story first, he identified a pattern rooted in his own upbringing, a household where his father had worked an exhausting, physically demanding job for decades specifically, so that his son would never have to do the same kind of labor, a sacrifice that instilled in him a deep, largely unconscious belief that any career choice not involving significant, visible personal sacrifice was somehow illegitimate, somehow disrespectful of everything his father had endured. This belief had quietly shaped his entire professional life, keeping him in a demanding, high-pressure role long after it had stopped genuinely serving him, because some part of him equated ease, or even ordinary sustainable balance, with a kind of betrayal of his father's own difficult story. Once named directly, this realization allowed him to examine his 6 dimensions with considerably more honesty than he'd previously managed. His spending, he realized, was reasonably well aligned with his values, modest, intentional, focused on family experiences rather than status purchases. His saving was technically strong by conventional measures, but almost entirely undifferentiated, one large, undefined pile labeled simply as the future, exactly the pattern we explored earlier with that couple who eventually learned to name their specific goals. His sharing was minimal, not due to any lack of generosity, but because the demanding pace of his work had left him little bandwidth to think beyond his own immediate household at all. His earning, the dimension most tangled up in his particular money story, was the one requiring the most honest, uncomfortable examination, forcing him to separate what his father's sacrifice had actually asked of him, which was simply to build a stable, decent life, from what his own inherited. Guilt had quietly added on top of that reasonable request, an unnecessary self-imposed requirement that his own work also involve constant strain and sacrifice in order to feel legitimate. His protection was solid, insurance and emergency savings both adequately in place, and his planning, like his saving, existed technically but lacked any genuine specific vision of what his own future was actually meant to contain. Beyond the vague, generic image of eventual retirement, everyone around him seemed to be working toward without much specific thought. Over the following year, he made a series of deliberate, examined adjustments, negotiating a modified role at his existing company that reduced some of the most demanding, sacrifice-signaling aspects of his previous position without abandoning his career or his income entirely, redirecting a portion of his previously undifferentiated savings towards specifically named goals connected to experiences with his own children, and beginning a small, consistent practice of giving that connected him, for the first time in years, to something beyond his own immediate, exhausting daily routine. None of these changes were dramatic in isolation. None of them involved quitting his job entirely or traveling the world for a year, the way Vitug himself once had. But together, they represented exactly the kind of deliberate, examined realignment, a genuinely chosen, values-aligned life. A year later, he described his financial life in terms strikingly similar to the settled, quiet confidence we discussed earlier. The same numbers, roughly, that he'd started with, but an entirely different felt experience of living inside them, no longer haunted by an inherited guilt he'd never consciously chosen to carry in the first place. That's the entire framework, distilled into two concrete actions. Actions that took Jason Vitug an entire year of travel, thousands of miles from the stable desk job his own inherited money story had once convinced him was the only acceptable path to finally arrive at honestly, but that don't necessarily require the same dramatic leap for you to begin applying them in your own life, starting today. Let's return, one final time, to that young man sitting in a corporate office in New Jersey, staring at a spreadsheet that should have made him feel secure, and instead left him feeling quietly hollow. He didn't abandon financial responsibility to chase some reckless fantasy. He examined, honestly, deliberately, what his one life was actually meant to be for, sitting in hostels, sharing meals with families who had far less than he did, and yet seemed to understand something he hadn't, listening to a small business owner explain why enough had always been enough for him, and slowly, piece by piece, building an entirely new relationship with money around that honest examination, one that eventually led him to found an entire platform dedicated to helping other people do exactly the same thing for themselves. He still thinks, often, about that mountain bus ride, about the lawyer who'd built an impressive fortune while quietly starving her own daily experience of life, and about the retiree who'd waited patiently, dutifully, for decades, only to receive his freedom decades later than his own body, energy would have preferred. He thinks about the elderly woman at that coastal community kitchen who'd survived genuine hardship and emerged with a clearer relationship to money than plenty of people who'd never once been seriously tested by real scarcity at all. And he thinks, often, about his own parents, who never got the chance to examine their own money story explicitly, who simply did what needed to be done, decade after decade, so that their son might eventually have the luxury, themselves never had the safety or the space to ask. He came to understand, eventually, that honoring their sacrifice didn't require repeating their exact path without ever questioning it, and it didn't require pretending their hard-won stability meant nothing to him either. It meant taking the security they'd fought so hard to build and using it, deliberately, honestly, as a foundation sturdy enough to actually ask what he wanted to build on top of it, rather than simply inheriting their answer wholesale without ever checking whether it was actually his own. That is the actual heartbeat of everything we've walked through together today. You only live once was never permission to spend recklessly, chasing temporary highs that fade within hours. It was never permission to defer every joy indefinitely either, following an inherited script of security and stability that might not actually reflect what you genuinely want from your own limited, irreplaceable time. It means examining your own money story honestly, identifying what genuinely matters to you, specifically, and then building your entire financial life, deliberately, around that honest examination, rather than around whatever definition of success you happen to inherit by default, whether that definition came from an anxious childhood kitchen, a status-conscious upbringing, or simply the quiet, unspoken assumption that the predictable path was always the correct one, because nobody around you had ever seriously questioned it either. If this reframing resonated with you at all, there's a simple, easy way to make sure you never miss the next story like this one. And honestly, that's really the only thing I'll ever ask of you, because somewhere out there right now, there's another person sitting at their own version of that desk, staring at their own spreadsheet, feeling quietly hollow despite every external marker suggesting they should feel secure, wondering if there's a different way to live this one, single, irreplaceable life they've actually been given. Perhaps it's someone still carrying a silence-based money story, avoiding their own statements for months at a time, quietly anxious every time the subject comes up at a dinner table. Perhaps it's someone chasing status-driven spending, upgrading a car or a home, purely to satisfy an old, inherited need to be seen a certain way by people who, honestly, matter far less than that inherited script insists they should. Perhaps it's someone caught in undeservingness, generous toward everyone else in their life, while quietly unable to spend anything meaningful on their own comfort or joy. Or perhaps it's someone rebuilding cautiously after a genuine loss, hyper-vigilant, unable to fully relax into decisions that would actually serve their current, considerably more stable circumstance. Whichever pattern happens to fit, the actual path forward looks remarkably similar in every single case. An honest, unhurried examination of where that pattern originally came from, followed by a deliberate, patient realignment across each of the 6 dimensions: spending, saving, sharing, earning, protecting, and planning, one honest adjustment at a time, exactly the way Jason Vitug once did it himself, first in hostels and long bus rides across unfamiliar countries, and later, gradually, back home, rebuilding an entire career and an entire platform around the very question that had once cracked open inside him at that desk in New Jersey. It starts with a single, honest question most people never actually stop long enough to ask themselves: what is all of this money actually for? There's a young man sitting in a corporate office in New Jersey, fluorescent light humming overhead, staring at a spreadsheet full of numbers